Reading the Times for Monday, February 24th, 2020. Europe confronts coronavirus as Italy battles an eruption of cases. The man had developed symptoms perhaps 5 days before that, potentially allowing the virus to spread. Even more disconcerting is the health officials still don't know how he contracted the virus because he had not been to China. According to the government decree, local officials are obliged to take all appropriate containment measures in the case that someone has tested positive for the virus, and the source of the contagion is unknown. Mr. Galera, the health official for Lombardy, said hospitals were increasing sensitive care facilities, and hotels and other structures were being identified as possible venues to isolate people with the virus. Sanders looks to knock out Biden as pressure builds on Democrats. Should Mr. Sanders defeat or even finish near Mr. Biden in South Carolina, a state the former vice president has long seen as his firewall, it could vault him into Super Tuesday 3 days later with such force that it may be difficult for any of his opponents to catch up with him. Even as Mr. Sanders braced for an onslaught of attacks many in his orbit thought would have come by now. There are a lot of knives out for Bernie Sanders, Mr. Weaver said. The senator appeared to be relishing his back-to-back victories. Mr. Sellers said Mr. Steyer's candidacy was a vanity project that would only siphon away votes from Mr. Biden and thrust Mr. Sanders into contention in South Carolina. D.C. prosecutors' tensions with Justice Department began long before Stone sentencing. Mr. Shea's predecessor, Jesse K. Liu, a lawyer whom Mr. Trump had appointed to lead the office in 2017, pressed the McCabe case even after one team of prosecutors concluded that they could not win a conviction. Still, her exit unnerved prosecutors and set off the chain of events that culminated in the current crisis, in which prosecutors in the office began to worry that Mr. Barr was intervening in sensitive cases for political reasons, even as he has publicly pushed back against Mr. Trump, a rebuke the president has ignored. Mr. Shea, who comes from a family of law enforcement officers, took over the office in early February, aware that Mr. Barr and the Justice Department had been parrying demands from the president to prosecute his enemies. As the startup boom deflates, tech is humbled. Last month, the robot pizza startup Zoom and the car-sharing company GetAround slashed more than 500 jobs. Investments in young companies have fallen, with 2,215 startups raising money in the United States in the last 3 months of 2019, the fewest since late 2016, according to the National Venture Capital Association and Pitchbook, which track startups. SoftBank bet big on companies like Uber and WeWork, as well as the Colombian delivery startup Rappi and the Indian hospitality startup Oyo. Teaching children how to reverse an overdose. In the past 3 years, the county's Drug Prevention Coalition has given Narcan training to an estimated 600 young children and teenagers in after-school programs, babysitting classes, and vaping cessation courses. In a region where socially conservative attitudes prevail, and addiction is often seen as a sin, health workers have encountered strong opposition from residents, school boards, and police officers who consider Narcan to be a waste of resources and the training inappropriate for children. Nolan Loveday, 10, described an overdose as using too much drugs. When Miss Reese asked what they should do after administering Narcan, Nolan's twin brother, Lennox, gave the correct answer. Call 911? Like most of the children, Nash was too young to fully grasp the complexities of addiction, but he understood enough to know that he can save a life with Narcan. Impact of the coronavirus ripples across Asia. It has been quiet, like cemetery. The coronavirus epidemic is taking its toll on global tourism, which, according to the World Travel and Tourism Council, contributed $8.8 trillion to the world economy in 2018. The economic toll is mounting. Countries have relied heavily on Chinese tourism, including Vietnam, Thailand, Cambodia, Malaysia, and Singapore, are each expected to lose at least $3 billion in tourism-related revenues, according to an analysis by Animesh Kumar, a travel and tourism director at Global Data, a research and consulting firm based in London. In Hong Kong, the tourism board chief, Dane Cheng, said tourism would take a bigger hit than it did during the outbreak of severe acute respiratory syndrome, or SARS, that struck the territory and mainland China 17 years ago. The fires are out, but Australia's climate disasters aren't over. One result of the multiplier effect for Australia, a global bellwether for climate change's effects, is that rebuilding after a disaster becomes far more complicated. Addressing climate change isn't something that is any responsibility of the Reserve Bank of Australia. But what we do have a responsibility to do is to understand the economic and the financial implication of climate change, he said. We've been writing about climate change being a stress multiplier for many years, said Leslie Hughes, a climate scientist at Macquarie University in Sydney. Venezuela's socialist embraced business-making partner of a parasite. Empresar Polar, the food conglomerate started by Mr. Mendoza's grandfather, had grown into the country's largest private company. Suddenly, Mr. Mendoza disappeared from public view, and Mr. Maduro stopped calling him a thief and a parasite and a traitor. The government quit harassing Polar with disruptive raids and began, in time, to adopt the economic changes Mr. Mendoza had proposed, like ending crippling price controls. The Mendoza family, who built Polar from a small brewery in the 1940s into a ubiquitous food conglomerate, has epitomized the traditional elites that Mr. Chavez promised to sweep away on taking power in 1999. Before the economic crisis, the company employed 34,000 people and claimed to produce 3.3% of the country's gross domestic product outside of oil. For a president who loves crowd size, India aims to deliver. World leaders are vying with each other to appeal to President Trump's vanity, said R. Nicholas Burns, a former Undersecretary of State under President George W. Bush, who helped pave the way for agreements with India during that administration. The United States and India have important issues involving trade and security for Mr. Trump and Mr. Modi to discuss, although administration officials briefing reporters before the president's departure from Washington on Sunday made clear that the comprehensive trade agreement he seeks with India remains far off. That's taken different forms in recent years, but the goal is always the same. Make Trump feel he's getting something unique. A parade in Paris, a grand state dinner in Buckingham Palace, or a sumo wrestling match with the President's Cup in Japan. Finance ministers grapple over economic threat of climate change. The United States, under pressure from European countries to address the economic threat of climate change, agreed on Sunday to include a reference to those risks in a joint statement at the conclusion of a meeting of the world's top economic leaders. The reference on the third page of the document and at the bottom of a long list of potential risks said the financial stability implications of climate change were being monitored by the G20's Financial Stability Board. Jerome H. Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, summed up the central bank's approach to climate change during his January news conference. Society's overall response to climate change needs to be decided by elected officials and not by the Fed. Israel strikes militants in Syria and Gaza after clash over body at border. Israel's hawkish defense minister Naftali Bennett defended the army's seizure of the body as appropriate, suggesting it could be used as a bargaining chip to recover the remains of 2 Israeli soldiers who have been held in Gaza since 2014. The day of tension began around 6:30 a.m. when Israel said its soldiers spotted 2 militants from the Palestinian Islamic Jihad group placing an explosive near the border east of Khan Younis in southern Gaza. An Israeli military spokesman said the 2 militants had been on Israeli soil, despite the fact that they were on the Gaza side of the Israeli security barrier. Hamas holds the bodies of Hadar and Oran, he wrote, referring to the bodies of the 2 Israeli soldiers, Lieutenant Hadar Golden and Sergeant Oran Shaul, that Hamas has been holding. Founder of French charity is accused of pattern of abuse. The report released last week by the French-based charity L'Arche International said that Jean Vanier, the charity's founder, had relationships with women from 1970 to 2005 that were at turns inappropriate, coercive, or non-consensual. He also said that he had a psychological hold over some of the victims. Some worked in the community and some were nuns, according to the Canadian newspaper, The Globe and Mail. Mr. Vanier, a Canadian religious leader who founded the charity in 1964, died in Paris last year at the age 90. The inquiry was commissioned in 2019 by the nonprofit charity after suspicions were raised as far back as 2014 by 2 women denouncing serious sexual misconduct committed by Thomas Philippe, a Catholic priest and scholar whom Mr. Vanier considered a spiritual father. L'Arche statement said Mr. Vanier had been member of a small clandestine group that included Father Philippe and some women, and that he adopted some of the deviant theories and practices of the priest, who died in 1993. The current leaders of L'Arche International, Stéphane Poizner and Stacy Cates-Carnet, denounced the actions of Mr. Vanier in a letter that they sent to L'Arche Fédération and that was published on Saturday. Religious groups in China step into the coronavirus crisis. In temples, mosques, and churches, China's religious believers have jumped into the national battle against the coronavirus. According to recent figures from their website, the China Buddhist Association has contributed $14 million to the fight against the coronavirus. The Protestant Association, $10 million. The Islamic Association, 4.5 million. The Catholic Association, 1.5 million. And the Taoist Association, 1.9 million. Even though all places of worship in China are closed as part of the effort to prevent the virus from spreading, temples and churches have been organizing prayer vigils, while halal restaurants in Wuhan have provided free meals and boxed lunches to medical staff at local hospitals. As coronavirus cases spiral, South Korea raises threat alert level. As South Korea struggles to contain a snowballing coronavirus outbreak, the president empowered the government on Sunday to lock down cities, bar visitors from China, and unilaterally restrict the movement of people by raising the country's alert level to the highest in a decade. The United States has raised its travel advisories for South Korea and Japan, warning about sustained community spread. Israel denied entry of 130 South Koreans on board a Korean air flight that landed in Tel Aviv on Saturday, forcing them to return home on the same plane. Daycare centers are shut. Outdoor rallies are banned. The reopening of schools in early March is being postponed, and churches are asking its congregants to stay home and pray online instead. But Mr. Moon said South Korea faced a wholly different situation following the quickly expanding outbreak among members of a Sincheonji Church of Jesus in Daegu, South Korea's fourth largest city, 180 miles southeast of Seoul. Don't send them here. Local officials resist plans to house coronavirus patients. At the hastily called news conference on Saturday, elected officials in Costa Mesa, a city of 113,000 people, about 40 miles south of Los Angeles, expressed opposition to a state plan to send dozens of patients to the Fairview Development Center, a nearly vacant state hospital formerly used for people with developmental disabilities. The city's 14-page request for a restraining order lists as defendants a group of state and federal actors, including the Defense Department, the Air Force, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, the State of California, and Governor Gavin Newsom's Office for Emergency Services. Plaintiffs now seek to prevent Costa Mesa from becoming ground zero to a state and potentially nationwide public health crisis caused because the state and federal governments have not sought to include local officials and emergency personnel in the planning and execution of their efforts, the city told the court in its filing. Coronavirus lockdowns torment an army of poor migrant workers in China. China's roughly 300 million rural migrants have long lived on the margins of society, taking on grueling work for meager wages and limited access to public health care and education. As a result, some migrant workers living in cities say they have been forced to pay thousands of dollars in medical expenses to treat sick relatives. The province, which is at home to more than 10 million migrant workers, remains shut off from the rest of China, and business has ground to a halt. In one state, juror can't block conviction. That may not last. If the Supreme Court rules that divided jury verdicts violate the Sixth Amendment guaranteeing a fair trial, Oregon may be forced to rethink large parts of its criminal justice system, including jury instructions, lawyers' tactics when picking jurors, as well as potentially thousands of previous convictions by divided juries. Victims' rights groups in Oregon say they also have concerns that ending non-unanimous jury convictions would lead to far more hung juries and mistrials, forcing victims to testify multiple times. About 300 cases are currently making their way through the Oregon Supreme Court and the Oregon Court of Appeals, challenging non-unanimous verdicts, including a challenge by Mr. Worley. Mike Hughes, 64, DIY daredevil, is killed in rocket crash. Mike Hughes, a go-it-alone daredevil, limousine stunt driver, and self-taught astronaut who professed to believe that the Earth was flat and who was known to supporters as Mad Mike, died in a rocket launch in the California desert on Saturday. A video of the launch posted by Justin Chapman, a freelance journalist, shows Mr. Hughes' steam-powered rocket shooting off into the sky and a parachute falling down to Earth. Last year, the documentary Rocket Man captured the crew of dreamers who worked to launch Mr. Hughes in a homemade rocket on a mission to prove that the Earth is flat. 5 takeaways from Nevada caucuses. The big one, Sanders takes control. Mr. Sanders has now won the most votes in each of the first 3 states and has more momentum than all his rivals and more money than everyone besides the 2 self-funding billionaires, Tom Steyer and Mr. Bloomberg. Mr. Biden, who carried black voters in Nevada, is best positioned to beat Mr. Sanders in an upcoming state. Advisors to his rivals and Democratic strategists who want to see Mr. Sanders stopped have been frustrated with Mr. Buttigieg's campaign, arguing that while he has been relatively successful so far, he is now in a demographic cul-de-sac. Harry Reid says Nevada should have a primary. All caucuses should be a thing of the past. Harry Reid, the former Senate Majority Leader who remains a functional head of Nevada Democrats, said Sunday that caucuses should no longer be used to nominate candidates for President of the United States. Mr. Reid's call to end caucuses adds to the growing momentum around the push for Democrats to shift their presidential nominating contest from caucuses to primaries. Only only Iowa, Nevada, North Dakota, and Wyoming, along with 3 territories, are holding caucuses in 2020. Still, Mr. Reid's call to end caucuses is a remarkable statement from the man who is single-handedly responsible for Nevada's caucuses, occupying the 3rd slot on the Democrats' presidential nominating calendar. Greyhound to stop allowing Border Patrol agents on its buses without warrants. The side-by-pay searches have negatively impacted both our customers and our operations, the company said in 2018, referring to Customs and Border Protection, the Border Patrol's parent agency, in a leaked Custom and Border Protection memo that was reported by the Associated Press. The Border Patrol chief confirmed that agents were prohibited from boarding buses and questioning passengers without warrants or the company's consent. The official did not directly address Greyhound's change, but added that enforcement operations away from the immediate border are performed consistent with the law and in direct support of immediate border enforcement and efforts, and such operations functions as a mean of preventing smuggling and other criminal organizations from exploiting of existing transportation hubs to travel further into the United States. Dueling narratives emerge from muddled account of Russia's 2020 interference. Their disagreement came as intelligence officials disputed reports that emerged last week about a briefing of the House Intelligence Committee. The officials now maintain that the House members either misheard or misinterpreted a key part of the briefing, and that the Office of the Director of National Intelligence did not mean to say that it believes the Russians are currently intervening in the election explicitly to help President Trump. Intelligence officials say the reports they have generated have been consistent. Russian activity did not end with the 2016 election. One side of a nuclear waste fight, Trump, the other his administration. Before the 2018 midterm elections, Senator Dean Heller stood with President Trump in the glittering Trump International Hotel near Las Vegas, looking out from the top floor and pointed, "Why should you have a nuclear waste in your backyard?" Mr. Trump asked the crowd at a rally in Las Vegas on Friday to applause, noting that recently released budget proposal did not include funding to license the site, as previous ones had. The story of a muddled and shifting position on Yucca Mountain is partly one of an administration focused on Mr. Trump's re-election chances in a battleground state that he lost to Hillary Clinton by 2 percentage points in 2016. Two of Mr. Trump's political advisors, Bill Stepien and Justin Clark, flagged Yucca Mountain early on as a political danger zone, particularly if Mr. Trump wanted to try to put Nevada in play in 2020. But it showed up in the budget, and Mr. Perry toured the site in March 2017, shortly after he and the Energy Department were sued by the Attorney General in Mr. Perry's home state, Texas, which has been one of the few places in the country accepting low-level nuclear waste for not licensing Yucca Mountain. National security wiretap system was long plagued by risk of errors and omissions. The problems may be part of a broader pattern in other applications that never receive the same intense scrutiny, according to interviews with more than 24 current and former FBI agents and Justice Department officials who have worked with national security wiretaps. FBI agents are also racing against the clock with FISA wiretaps, good for 90 days, which can also leave them open to confirmation bias, former officials said. Dennis Brady, a retired FBI senior agent who worked with FISA applications, went further, suggesting case agents themselves should have to sign the documents. Syria's drawn-out agony. President Recep Tayyip Erdogan of Turkey has threatened to block the Syrian advance militarily, and on Thursday, 2 Turkish soldiers were killed in a Russian airstrike inside Syria, with the Trump administration showing little appetite for any involvement in Middle East conflicts, and Europe effectively sidelined. Russia, Syria, and Turkey are calling the shots. Though Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has issued statements in support of Turkey and might be happy to fan differences between Turkey and Russia, which have drawn close in recent years, there remains no viable resistance inside Syria for America to support, even if anyone in the administration had any interest in doing so. Twitter is real life. In one reading, the "Twitter isn't real life" mantra is perhaps a laudable attempt at self-reflection by the media and the political elite. Each "Twitter isn't real life" piece seemed to perform extremely well on Twitter, especially among a kind of centrist political and media elite who bristled at the extreme opinions of far-right and far-left-leaning Twitter folk. The cries of "Twitter isn't real life" became a filter bubble of their own, a way to assuage those who traditionally had great influence over creating political narratives, that they are still in touch with the body politic. Bernie Sanders is making a big mistake. In the 2018 midterm, Sanders-style candidates lost swing districts, while candidates demonstrating respect to swing voters won again and again. Many working class voters, including people of color, agree with that. One of them is the passionate support he inspires, which gives him an opportunity to reach out to new voters while holding on to his base. Don't doubt Bernie. Sanders is, for the moment, the clear frontrunner to win the Democratic nomination. The Russians may well like some of Sanders' non-interventionist foreign policy instincts, but it is just as likely that they find Sanders to be the most destabilizing Democratic candidate. There are jitters among the Democratic political class that Sanders is running against them, not with them, and will have a negative effect down ballot. Will the Appalachian Trail stop an $8 billion pipeline? The outcome could upend pipeline construction here and elsewhere in the country should a planned pipeline cross one of the nation's 11 national scenic trails. Pipeline protests have erupted across the country, especially here in Appalachia. And it's not just crunchy hikers and tree huggers rallying to stop the Atlantic Coast Pipeline. Pipelines are dangerous. From January 2010 to November 2018, fossil fuel pipelines in the United States have resulted in more than 5,500 accidents, 800 fires, 300 explosions, 600 injuries, and 125 fatalities, according to a 2019 analysis by nonprofit group Frack Tracker. One tiny, beautiful thing. In Mississippi, power was out for days. It didn't rain for the following day. The day that the president fired Lieutenant Colonel, the woods were as lovely as they ever are after a rain, the creeks full of rushing water, the gray bark of the fallen trees, slick with moss. The nasty surprise of medical bills. Dr. Elizabeth Rosenthal correctly explains the reasons surprise medical bills exist. Elizabeth Rosenthal's article discusses Washington's inaction on legislation to stop surprise medical billing. Americans are going broke paying for surprise medical bills while Washington is all talk but no action. Should college divest from fossil fuels? In 2013, responding to student and alumni demands that Harvard divest from fossil fuel companies, Drew Gilpin Faust, then the president of Harvard, favored engagement over withdrawal. In 2019, Lawrence Buckow, the current president, wrote that Harvard still prefers engaging with industry to a divestment. Debbie Lockwood calls for Harvard to divest from fossil fuels, contending that it would be position the university as a climate change leader. It would position the university as climate change leader. Like Harvard, Swarthmore knows it can divest because it has in the past from apartheid South Africa, and because numerous institutions have remained unscathed after divesting from fossil fuels. FIT model refuses to wear clearly racist accessories. The show date was fast approaching, but the earrings he had made didn't show up well. Miss Davis said she didn't know of the existence of the accessories until I saw them presented at the show. She met with students after the show, she said, to discuss their concerns. Two designers who were also part of the show, speaking on condition of anonymity because they were worried about backlash from the faculty, said they had approached the organizers the day of the show after seeing the accessories. Phil Murphy, New Jersey governor, says he has a kidney tumor. Governor Phil Murphy of New Jersey said on Saturday he would undergo surgery next month to remove a tumor on his kidney. I've got a tumor on my left kidney and will undergo surgery. Undergo a partial nephrectomy in early March to remove it. Mr. Murphy, a Democrat, wrote on Twitter, the Lieutenant Governor, Sheila Y. Oliver, will serve as acting governor while Mr. Murphy is hospitalized, Mr. Gunaratna said. A New York issue that unites landlords and the NAACP, changing the city's property tax formula, would first require approvals from the mayor and the city council, and ultimately the state legislature and Governor Andrew M. Cuomo. The reason for the litigation is that the political will to do this does not exist, said John Gallagher, a spokesman for the group, known as Tax Equity Now New York. It would not be the first time that a lawsuit paved the way for meaningful change in New York City policy. A court battle ended the overuse of stop-and-frisk tactics by the New York City Police Department. A lawsuit also brought about the end of the city's Board of Estimate. Already online message boards like Nextdoor, debates have kindled over a proposal floated last Already on online message boards like Nextdoor, debates have kindled over a proposal floated late last week by the City Commission, which was convened by the mayor and the City Council Speaker, Corey Johnson. Streaming TV's boom is a mixed blessing for some Hollywood writers. The typical TV writer schedule looks something like this. Get hired by May or June. Write furiously for most of the year, and then take a 6-week hiatus before the process started again. The old TV calendar is not quite dead. Major producers of network shows like Dick Wolf and Chuck Lorre still must come up with at least 22 episodes per season of shows like NBC's Chicago PD and CBS's Young Sheldon. But with the new streaming platform like NBC Universal's Peacock and HBO Max set up to start in the spring, the lives of many TV writers are likely to get more chaotic. Jonathan Shikora, a Los Angeles lawyer who represents actors and writers, suggested that longtime TV writers were now underpaid. Intuit is expected to buy Credit Karma in $7 billion deal. Credit Karma grew to be worth billions of dollars by selling credit card offers to its customers after building their credit profiles. In addition to providing credit scores from TransUnion and Equifax, Credit Karma now offers advice on how the scores could be improved by doing things like lowering credit card balances. Over time, Credit Karma's success invited imitators, and today most digital financial firms offer their customers free credit scores. Digital edits a paid army. Bloomberg is destroying norms on social media. His campaign's digital team edited the debate into digestible bites on social media that made Mr. Bloomberg appear as though he had done better. His campaign said it's paying people to use their own social media accounts to publish content of their choosing to mobilize voters for Mr. Bloomberg. The campaign said the digital organizers would not add disclosures to every post, but they would be directed to clearly identify in their social media profiles they were affiliated with the Bloomberg campaign. Gunmakers battle Trump slump with softer sales pitch. His campaign's digital team edited the debate into... okay. Sales slumped after the election of Mr. Trump, a vocal supporter of firearms, because gun buyers stopped worrying about losing access to guns. Firearms companies use keyword blocking technology to help keep their ads from appearing near online news articles that mention school shootings, murder, or gun violence. Garden and Gun, Hook and Barrel, and other magazines mix stories about guns with travel diaries and pop culture features. Raf Simons becomes co-creative director at Prada in a move that could reshape the fashion world. Miuccia Prada and Patrizio Bertelli, the creative director and chief executive of Prada Group, the thinking woman's brand and one of the gravitational poles of the Italian industry, announced on Sunday that they were appointing the Belgian designer Raf Simons as co-creative director of Prada. The disclosure came on the final day of Milan Fashion Week and 2 days after what was Miss Prada's last solo ready-to-wear show at a live news conference held in the brand's headquarters. Robert Burke, founder of an eponymous luxury consultancy and the former fashion director of Bergdorf Goodman, said, "It is a strong strategic move positioning the house for the future. It will be well received by the Prada customer and will also bring a new customer to the brand. It is a much more natural fit than the Calvin job. It could start a trend, and perhaps an important one, since a number of brands need to plan for the future." A feminist cookbook meant to inspire fuels outrage instead. The last thing Kathy Gunst and Catherine Alford expected when they published their cookbook, Raging Baking, was for the rage to be directed at them. In her Medium post, she had shared screenshots of messages sent to her by Miss Gunst and Miss Alford, in which the authors explained, "We have seen a range of people using Rage Bake and Rage Baking independently to describe their efforts for the past several years." Miss Gunst, who had written more than a dozen cookbooks, said in an interview, "I was aware of the hashtag Rage Baking. I was aware of the hashtag Rage Baker, Feminist Baker. There are quite a few women on social media who are bakers and activists. I was absolutely aware of her." How to find the best CPA or tax accountant near you. The one qualification every paid tax preparer must have is a Preparer Tax Identification Number, or PTIN. Anyone can apply for a PTIN online for free, so a PTIN alone is an indicative of the person's skill or experience. If you make less than $56,000 per year or are age 60 or older, you might want to look into having your tax return prepared through the Volunteer Income Tax Assistance or Tax Counseling for the Elderly programs. Are you available for questions outside of tax season? Some tax preparers set up shop during tax season only to disappear shortly after April 15th. This week in tech, coronavirus hits Apple's financial forecast. I'm Nellie Bowles, a tech and culture reporter. Here now with a roundup of the news. In Europe, leaders are very good at regulating technology, pioneering responses to issues of privacy and antitrust. But can it build tech giants of its own? My colleagues Adam Satariano and Monica Brunskuk wrote, "As Europe has created a reputation as the world's most aggressive watchdog of Silicon Valley, it has failed to nurture its own tech ecosystem. That has left countries in the region increasingly dependent on companies that many leaders distrust. Now it's trying to change that and reclaim technology sovereignty." Not surprisingly, Silicon Valley companies have been making more trips to Brussels recently to lobby against some of that regulation. A new digital policy, including first-of-its-kind rules on the ways that artificial intelligence can be used by companies, Adam wrote. And that has been Reading the Times for Monday, February 24th, 2020.